into the GSMC Football Podcast, brought to you once again by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you once again today. Today we'll be covering in our first segment some additional NFL news rumors that we didn't get to yesterday, as well as primarily just focusing on Myles Garrett and where he could potentially end up going this offseason. And then later in the show, we have our continued season outlooks that we've got going on. We've got some other teams in the AFC South. We started with the AFC South yesterday, and we're going to continue that with the Titans, and then later in the show is the Texans. And make sure you do stick around for later in the show, because I will be giving you my predicted records for each of those teams going into next year. And before we start, I just would like to ask that you guys like and follow the show. Any sort of support and comments do definitely help us out. And if you do have a question that you want to ask during the show, we do want to hear it. So your input is a big part of what makes this show great. So we thrive on your energy and your insights. So whether it's a quick comment, a thoughtful question, or an opinion that you just have to share, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat. Now, if you want to make absolutely sure that your message stands out and gets featured on the show, there's also an easy way to do that. Use the super chat filter. Just click the $sign at the bottom of the chat box to send in your super chat. This will guarantee that your message gets on the air, and it's also a fantastic way to support our channel. We rely on your support to keep bringing you the sports content that you love, and we appreciate every single bit of it. So go ahead, let us know what you're thinking. Hit that super chat button, and let's keep the show as interactive and exciting as possible. And if you prefer, you can also go to gsmcsports.net to tip, donate, and leave a comment or question there. We couldn't do what we do without your amazing support. So once again, we are so thankful to have you guys as part of our community. So let's go ahead and get into the first segment of the show here. We're going to be talking a little bit about Myles Garrett and where he could potentially end up as we kick off the NFL free agency period that starts next week. So taking a look at Myles Garrett, obviously he wants to be gone from Cleveland. We talked a little bit about it a few days ago on a couple other shows, but he basically gave them the notice, that he does not want to be there. The Browns did offer him a contract, which he ended up shutting down. We did speak a little bit about that as well. So it's pretty clear that money's not really an issue for Myles Garrett. He wants to go somewhere where he's going to be able to compete for a Super Bowl. So right now in Cleveland, he's not going to really be able to do that. So I definitely think he will be on the move, and he's going to probably, garner at least 2 first-round picks, most likely, to try and get him away from Cleveland. Cleveland has said that they don't want to trade him, but it's looking more and more likely that they're going to be forced into it because Myles Garrett just does not want to be there. Did have a few potential teams that he could end up going to, and it could end up being that neither one of these teams are the team that he ends up landing with. These are just my personal opinions on some of the places that I think he could potentially go. So first on that list is the defending Super Bowl champion, the Philadelphia Eagles. They have, notoriously a very, very good defensive front. Secondary is really good as well, but it's that defensive front that really does all of the dirty work and is why they are as good as they are and why they dominated as much as they did against the Chiefs in the Super Bowl a couple months back. But you put Myles Garrett there, especially with a guy like Milton Williams getting ready to potentially leave through free agency. He may not re-sign with the Eagles. And if he doesn't, then it's definitely possible that Myles Garrett could find himself in Philadelphia. I know they've expressed interest, from all of these talks about, Myles Garrett wanting to leave Cleveland. The Eagles have definitely shown interest, and it would just be another great player to add to their already loaded defense. And you could just imagine what they, were able to do this year, especially against Kansas City in that Super Bowl. And then you multiply that by whatever Myles Garrett will bring to the table, which, is usually potential defensive player of the year consideration. Typically, even when he was in Cleveland, that's what his standard was. He was right up there with the best in the league. So putting him in Philadelphia would be almost unfair for offenses, with they already having such a great defensive front anyway. So that could be something that the Eagles look into. They just signed Saquon Barkley today, so that eats up a little bit of the cap room that they could have. But, of course, they can always do restructures and things of that nature. If they really wanted to get Myles Garrett, they could make it happen. Another team to look out for when it comes to Myles Garrett, one that actually just made a pretty recent big addition, and that was the Washington Commanders when they added Deebo Samuel a couple days ago. But I think the Commanders could absolutely be in play for Myles Garrett just because, they have issues on the defense. Being able to stop the run is a big deal in today's NFL, especially, with the Commanders playing in the NFC East, having to face Saquon Barkley twice a year and potentially, Ashton Genty if the Cowboys decide to go that route in the draft. If he ends up being as good as he was in college, then that's another great running back that you have to deal with in that division. So obviously the Commanders want to shore up that defense as much as possible if that did happen. But I could see Myles Garrett landing there just because they do have the cap space. They can pay him what he needs to be paid or what he feels he deserves to be paid. They could absolutely pay him, and they've already shown that they are willing to go out there and be aggressive and try and get as best a team around Jaden Daniels as possible. They got one game shy of the Super Bowl last year with the rookie in Jaden Daniels, and he's only going to get better. So you fix that defense, shore up some holes, and Myles Garrett would go a long way in doing that. And then you could potentially talk about this team contending in the NFC to come out of the NFC next year and maybe get to the Super Bowl. Long way to go from, for that, of course, but that's just something to think about. The Commanders were very good last year, so you feel like a guy like Myles Garrett could come in there and make a huge difference for that defense. They still have a couple other things that they need to get together as well on defense, but adding a guy like that would absolutely, put them pretty close to being, one of the elite defenses in the NFL. That's just how good Myles Garrett is. So another team to look at as well, which I think actually is less likely than the other two that I stated before, but the Detroit Lions. They could potentially land him, and just having him paired with Aiden Hutchinson, assuming Hutchinson can stay healthy after he was knocked out all of last year with his injury. But if both of those guys can stay healthy, which has been the issue for the Lions really, is being able to stay healthy. At least that's what the case was last year, especially on defense. They lost a lot of guys on defense. Alex Anzalone was a big name that they lost. They lost Aiden Hutchinson as well, obviously. But a lot of injuries on defense, and they could add more to that defense that would definitely help them should a guy like Aiden Hutchinson go down, because Myles Garrett has been relatively healthy in his career so far to this point. So even if you lose Aiden Hutchinson to an injury like that, again, you can still make up the slack with having Myles Garrett there. Not to mention when that defense is healthy, of course, that will propel them to being, not necessarily an elite defense, but definitely a solid one for sure. So those are the three teams that I could see potentially landing Myles Garrett. I don't think he goes back to Cleveland, so that's why I didn't, add Cleveland into this list, just simply because he doesn't want to be there anymore, and I think he's made that pretty clear, for the most part. But there's a couple other little things that I wanted to touch on, just in case we had time, and we do have a little bit of time, so I just wanted to touch on these. Today, Sam Darnold was allowed by the Vikings to officially become a free agent or to test the market, and I think that just kind of closes the book on his time in Minnesota for the most part. I feel like that's Minnesota basically telling him that they're going to ride with J.J. McCarthy, the rest of the way, or, just to at least see what they have in him, because they invested a first-round pick on him. So definitely that's what they want to do, and that's assuming that's kind of what I assumed that they were going to do anyway. Sam Darnold did have a decent, or more than decent year. He had a very good year last year. He had 35 touchdown passes, which is actually funny because that is the most touchdown passes thrown by a player who did not return to the same team the next year. So just an interesting little fact that I, saw, on the rounds of doing research and stuff like that. I just thought that was kind of interesting. But Sam Darnold I would look at a team like, a lot of people have said the Giants and everything, but I just don't see him going back to New York. I mean, I know it's not the Jets, but I don't see him going back there. He's had a bad experience in that building, regardless. So I don't see that happening. Tennessee would be a team that, I would look at potentially. They could, scoop him up, and then maybe instead of drafting a quarterback in a less than stellar quarterback draft class that is this year, they can add to their defense, pick up a good, solid defensive lineman with that first pick, maybe go after Abdul Carter with the number 1 pick. Maybe you get a skill position player like a Travis Hunter. I believe he came out as a defensive back through the NFL draft and everything, but he's a gadget guy, a guy who could play multiple positions. So that's just an ultimate weapon that you want, especially if he can do it at a high level. But I would say that Sam Darnold could potentially go to Tennessee, but it looks like the most likely landing spot, I would kind of look at the Raiders, I don't really think that they're going to go after anybody in the draft, or at least I don't believe that they are going to be drafting high enough to be able to get one of the guys that they really, really want, unless they decide to trade up, which is another thing the Titans might do, is they could trade that number 1 pick, and trade back and, pick a little bit later. And then if they did that, then I think that would be more and more likely that they were going to go after a quarterback in free agency or a trade. And in this case would be Sam Darnold, in my opinion. Would just be kind of an interesting spot for him to go, or just something to think about at least. But another piece of news, I did kind of briefly touch on it when we were talking earlier about the Myles Garrett situation, but Saquon Barkley, he became the highest paid running back in NFL history today by signing his 2-year, $41 million extension with the Eagles. Not really a surprise that they wanted to get a deal done to lock him up, after having the year that he did, and then on the back of, being Offensive Player of the Year, and then, of course, ending up winning the Super Bowl this year. Not a surprise that they locked him in. He's a great running back, well deserving of it, and kind of set the market for how valuable running backs are leading into this coming off season and this draft, really, with all the good running backs that are available in the draft. It kind of put the importance of having a really good running back, on the board there, whereas they were kind of taking a back seat for a number of years there. But now with the emergence of Saquon Barkley in Philly, and then, of course, Derrick Henry in Baltimore, it kind of just puts the emphasis on the need for a really good running back. So, just an interesting little piece of information there. But that's it for the first segment of this show. When we come back, we're going to dive a little bit more into our season outlook series. We've got the Tennessee Titans coming up in the second segment. And then, of course, we have the Houston Texans to finish everything out. But look forward to that. We will be right back. Just stay with us. We'll be right back in just a few minutes.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows with 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Okay, guys, welcome on back to our second segment in this show. Before we go ahead and get into all of that, I do want to just remind you guys that if you have any questions or comments that you want to jump in with on the show, just jot them down in the comments section or in the super chat section of the show. If you want to make sure that your name is heard, your voice is heard, definitely do that. Or you can go to GSMCsports.net to tip, donate, and leave a comment or a question there. And of course, everything is always greatly appreciated. So let's go ahead and get into the next segment of our show when we're going to continue our season outlook series. This time we're going to be talking about the Tennessee Titans as we kick things off here. Now, obviously the Titans have the number one pick of the draft this year. We've been talking about it over the past few days with the combine and everything happening. Just to kind of refresh of what happened with the Titans this year, obviously that number one pick is because they had a 3-14 record, the worst record in the NFL. So was not a great year. Will Levis, who they drafted a couple years ago, has not really turned out to be a very good quarterback, or at least a franchise guy to this point in his career. So you got to figure that they're going to probably go quarterback to try and compete with Will Levis, whether that be in free agency or if they decide to go after a guy like Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders in the draft with that number one pick. They do have a new GM this year. A lot of change has been happening in Tennessee over the past few years, with them obviously letting go of Mike Vrabel a couple years ago, hiring Bill Callahan as the head coach. He comes back again this year, but they have a new GM. So obviously, it's going to be a little bit of a different direction. You know, every time you have a new GM that comes in, that's typically what happens. So it'll be interesting to see what they decide to do going forward in the offseason. As I said before, the free agency period starts March 12th at 4 p.m. So any of these deals that we've been talking about, they don't get finalized until then. So there's still time for teams to talk and, you know, get things out of there. So definitely going to be an interesting few weeks, but as far as the Titans are concerned, you take a look at the offseason moves that they made last year. They were no real stranger to making pretty aggressive moves. They went after Tyler Boyd, who was a free agent from Cincinnati. They signed him. They went after L'Jarius Sneed from Kansas City, went and got him. They have Calvin Ridley still on the roster. They had a good young receiver in Westbrook Akine that they might have to consider re-signing, as he's set to be a free agent as well. So wide receiver is going to be a question mark as well. But first things first, they have to take care of the quarterback position, because last year did not work out with Will Levis. He made a lot of really, really bad errors, you know, especially early on in the year, costing his team a couple of wins in the early going with a pick six that he had, and then, of course, a fumble that he had on a just ill-advised play in which he tried to toss it back to his running back, and it just didn't work out, and it ended up being a fumble, which was returned for a touchdown, and that ended up losing them the game ultimately. But he made a number of plays like that, which is a problem. That's something that he needs to fix. When you take a look at his stats last year, obviously he didn't start every single game. He was banged up a little bit. There were times where he was held out. So Mason Rudolph got the starting job for a few weeks there. He played in about 8 games, I believe, but Will Levis played in 12 games overall. And he ended up with 13 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. So a little over 2,000 yards passing. Not really what you want to see, you know, out of your potential future, you know, franchise quarterback. Taking a look at what they did just overall as an offense, they were ranked near the bottom of the league last year in most categories. Primarily, they finished 27th in points per game with just 18.3 points per game, so very low number there. You always want to at least be in the 24s or above, you know, to be at least a solid offense. And if you don't have those numbers, you better have a really, really good defense. And unfortunately, the Titans didn't really have that. Now, they have some players on defense that are decent players, you know. Harold Landry, although didn't really do as much as they would have liked him to do, he's still a decent player. Jeffrey Simmons is also a very good pass rusher, very good guy to have in the middle of the field there, in the middle of the line. And then, of course, Tavondre Sweat on that line as well. That's a pretty solid combination to build around. So they could go after defensive line work. I know they were kind of interested in some defensive tackles that they could look at potentially in the draft this year. Take a look at their wide receiver, as we mentioned before. Westbrook Akine is one of the free agents that kind of jumps out at you that you might want to sign, because it did seem like he had started to kind of gain a little bit of a comfortability with the offense and with Will Levis in particular towards the end of this past year. He's a good young receiver, so definitely some potential there if they can work out the quarterback situation there. Mason Rudolph's not there anymore. Will Levis is currently the only quarterback on the roster at this point. Taking a little bit further look into some of their needs. Some receivers, I know we talked about they may need some depth at receiver. Devontae Adams was just released today by the New York Jets. So that could be an interesting prospect, them to go out and possibly get Devontae Adams. Cooper Kupp is still an available receiver too. He's still currently under contract with the Rams, but he has made it open. They've made it abundantly clear that they are allowing him to seek a trade. So he is an available receiver that they could potentially go after. It may not cost them a whole heck of a lot of money either. So something to think about there as they try to bolster that receiver room, because right now it's just Calvin Ridley and Tyler Boyd, who are both solid receivers, but you need a little bit of depth as well, especially with Tyler Boyd being a little bit banged up last year. But definitely a solid defensive line. They get some depth at receiver, maybe shore up a couple other positions here and there, and you could see them, having a much better year than last year. I don't think it's going to be much, better in terms of like the wins. I don't see it being one of these crazy turnarounds where they go like from 3-14 to 14-3 or something like that. Don't assume that that's going to happen. They still have a lot of work to do, and they still haven't figured out this quarterback position, which is the most important position in football, as we have said. So with Will Levis, you don't really feel 100% comfortable with him being your number one guy. You got to have somebody in there to compete with him. Another kind of a dark horse sort of candidate, if they don't want to go quarterback, or maybe they want to bring in a guy to potentially push Will Levis, or maybe he wins the job in training camp. But Russell Wilson, he's going to be probably pretty cheap. He's obviously a free agent, so he's not going to be, the veteran minimum like he was in Pittsburgh last year, but he's not going to be a crazy amount like Denver paid for him either. So if you're looking for kind of like a Band-Aid quarterback and maybe try and get to next year when it's a better cream of the crop in quarterbacks in next year's draft, that could be something that they do, sign Russell Wilson to, a cheap 1, maybe 2-year deal, and they could kind of just see where he can take them in that offense. It's got to be better than what they did last year, though, because they're not going to get much better overall as a team if that offense doesn't improve. The offensive line needs to be, taken care of as well. No matter what quarterback that you have back there, it's not going to really matter what you do or who you pick up if you don't have an offensive line that can protect him, so it's, if you take a look at the right-hand side of that offensive line, that's been the real issue. They, as right tackles, just that group of right tackles, it was a revolving door. There was several different players that played on that side of the line of scrimmage last year, and the right tackles anyway gave up a league-high 29 sacks, more than any other position group in the NFL, definitely the most in that particular position group. So that is, of course, alarming. You got to fix that. You can't go around with an offensive line that's giving up that many sacks on just one side of the ball. They gave up 49 sacks total on the year, which was, right up there as being one of the highest in the league. So you can't have a nice young franchise quarterback, that you drafted behind a line like that. And you can't have, as we saw in Pittsburgh in the later years, if they do decide to go with Russell Wilson, they can't have a shaky offensive line because he can't get away from the pressure like he used to. So they have to absolutely shore up that offensive line. I mean, that's, on a lot of teams, most teams in the NFL, especially the ones that are trying to be competitive, they build from the line out usually. Obviously, you want to go get your franchise quarterback, but for the most part, once you get your franchise quarterback, you want to build the trenches because that's where the game is won. And if any team proved that last year, it was Philadelphia when they won the Super Bowl. They're strong on both lines, both offensive and defensive line, as we talked about their defensive line a little bit in that Myles Garrett section. But teams like that, those are the teams that are successful, and that's where the Titans want to go. When they had Mike Vrabel, they had a team that was similar to that. They ran the ball very, very well. Defensive line has always been okay, but not right up there in the elite conversations. But that offensive line has typically been solid, especially when they had Derrick Henry. So that's something that they need to get back to if they want to, go ahead and go, be one of those teams again that can compete for a championship. There's a lot of good running backs in the draft this year too. So the Titans could go after a running back, maybe not with the first pick. I mean, of course, they could go Ashton Genty if they really were that desperate about it, but I don't think they do that. I think there's too many other holes on this team for them to go running back with the first overall pick. So maybe they go get a guy in day 2. You could still get a talented running back who could be a day 1 contributor in day 2 of the draft. It's very possible. It's a very deep class. So not all of the great running backs or, potential really, really good running backs are going to be all gone after the first round. There's still going to be some players there available. So that'll be interesting to see what the Titans do. As far as their record, like I said before, I could see them improving for sure, but I don't think it's going to be a crazy turnaround, in terms of their record. I could see them getting maybe 5 wins this year. Maybe they get 6 if they get the quarterback situation worked out, depending on who they get and how they end up turning out, whether they draft Cam Ward and he's an instant C.J. Stroud type of player, makes a huge difference right away. If they don't do that, then, I don't see them going much further than about 5 wins or so. So I've got them right now as 5-12. That's my official grade for their official record prediction for them. So we'll see how that turns out. Once again, like I always say, these season outlook predictions are very, very early in the whole offseason business. This team could be completely changed by the time we get to the preseason and training camp and all that. But as it stands right now, I have them as 5-12, and we'll see if they can, be better than that, or if they match it, or if they do worse. We'll see. All things are a possibility with this team. So with that, we're going to take another quick break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the Houston Texans to close things out. So just stick with us for a little bit, and we'll get right to the Houston Texans. All right, guys, we'll be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
All right, guys, welcome on back to our third and final segment of the show. We're going to be going more into our season outlook series, and this time we're going to be covering the Houston Texans. So take a look at what they did last year. They finished 10-7, won the division in the AFC South, although that division is not necessarily known for its intense competition, as most of those teams have struggled, to put it lightly, over the past few years. But the Texans were 10-7, won the division for the second straight year. They did, however, take a little bit of a step back offensively, and losing a guy like Tank Dell for a number of weeks, even early in the season, and then again later in that season with that devastating knee injury that he had against the Chiefs in the regular season. It was a tough year for Tank Dell. But Nico Collins, still another really good receiver. He missed a couple games too. But those were all definitely factors. They did add Stephon Diggs in the offseason last year. He didn't make a whole bunch of an impact, as he was effective early on, scored a touchdown in his first game with the Texans, and looked like he was going to be a really big impact player, but didn't really bring what they wanted to bring. And of course, he did get banged up a little bit as well. Texans had a lot of injuries, at the receiver position. But you take a look at C.J. Stroud, too, coming off of a year in which he had 30-plus touchdowns as a rookie. He was very, very good as a rookie. Take a look at his numbers this year: 20 touchdowns, 12 interceptions, lost 5 of these 6 fumbles that he had this year, lost 5 of them. So he didn't have a great year. After winning, Rookie of the Year in his first year, and rightfully so, he was dynamic, really hit the ground running in the NFL. He kind of got a little bit of a reality check this year, I think. Still think he's a very good quarterback, talented young quarterback, and could, potentially get back to that same status that he had when he was a rookie, playing as well as he did. But they have another issue too, and that's offensive line. They were not one of the better teams at protecting C.J. Stroud, so that could have contributed to a little bit of a dip in his play this year. It's hard to really say the word regressed, because that offensive line did struggle so much, and he is still a young quarterback, so he's still kind of coming into his own at the same time. So I don't really fault him too much. Every quarterback has a down year or something like that. He still has the talent to be an elite quarterback in the league. He may not be in the elite status, right now, especially after the year that he had, but he absolutely has the potential to be an elite quarterback. So they're not down on C.J. Stroud really too much, in Houston, nor should they be. It was just an off year. And they still won the division, it's not a very super competitive division, but they won the division nonetheless. So that is an accomplishment in its own. They did win their first playoff game this year, their wild card game against the Chargers. Were able to beat them in a game that I actually picked the Chargers to win, so I was a little surprised that the Texans won. But mainly, the reason the Texans won that game is what carried them all of last year, really, was that defense that they had, led by Danielle Hunter and, of course, Will Anderson Jr. Both of those guys led the team with sacks. Hunter had 12, and 11 was Will Anderson's total this year. So they had a very, very good defense. They are maybe another player or two away from being a truly elite defense. Actually consider maybe Myles Garrett. I know we talked about him in the first segment, but that could be a team that could move some money around and maybe, get a guy, or get Myles Garrett, maybe get a draft pick or number 1 pick or something like that, because that's what it's going to take to get Myles Garrett, is a couple of first-round picks more than likely. But that's a team that, definitely kind of keep an eye on. They're kind of an interesting team there when it comes to Myles Garrett. That would be an incredible add to that defense. And you take a look at the rest of their team, what they did last year. Joe Mixon, coming over from Cincinnati, was solid. He had over 1,000 yards, led the team in total touchdowns. He had 11 rushing, 1 receiving, so 12 total touchdowns, more than any other player on the team. He was very effective. Dameon Pierce is the backup there. He is a decent backup, but you figure they may dip into the draft with all the talent at the running back position in the draft this year that we've kind of talked about a lot already. But they could maybe dip into the draft and get some depth pieces, around Joe Mixon, because Joe Mixon is 30 years old. So he's not, a super, super young quarter or running back. He's not up there in his age, he's not like an older running back, but he hits, once running backs hit 30, that typically, if you're not Derrick Henry, that's when running backs kind of begin to show signs that they're declining a little bit or that they're losing a step. He's still got a few good years left in him, I believe, Joe Mixon, but it doesn't hurt to get some depth behind a player like that. So I look for them to maybe do that on like a day 3 sort of trade, or not trade, but draft. So something to look into. As we said, CJ Stroud they're pretty much set at quarterback. They don't really need to get anything as far as quarterback is concerned. Defense was solid. They were 4th in the league with sacks, with a total of 49 sacks. And Hunter and Anderson wrecked shop a lot of the time, so they're pretty straight on defense. It's the interior offensive line help that they really need right now. I've seen a lot of mock drafts that are kind of aiming towards the Alabama offensive lineman Tyler Booker for the Texans to go in the first round. I believe that they are going to go offensive lineman with their first pick. They picked 25, if I remember correctly. So I looked for them to go offensive lineman. There's a couple other guys they could go after, but I've seen a lot of Tyler Booker in a lot of the mocks that I've read or, watched on YouTube or, something like that. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. I think they're going to go offensive lineman, like I said. Wide receiver, they need some help as far as depth is concerned because we just don't know what's going on with Tank Dell. His injury that he had right at the tail end of last year was a really, really bad knee injury. He's most likely going to miss this year, or at the very least a very good big chunk of it. But it's looking like he may be gone for, the whole year. And you need to bring somebody in to back up Nico Collins, because Nico Collins got hurt last year too. He only missed a couple games though, but he, is susceptible to injury as well. And they don't think that they're going to bring back Stephon Diggs. He was only on a 1-year deal. Don't think they're going to bring him back. Wouldn't surprise me if they did though, especially with the depth, needed on that offense. But they could go after a guy like Davante Adams. I know we mentioned possibly the Titans going after a guy like that, but you figured Davante Adams probably wants to go somewhere where he feels like he can compete for like a legit contender, and I feel like the Texans are just a couple pieces away from being one of those legit contenders. I mean, if you take a look back at last offseason, a lot of people were talking about the Texans as being one of the main contenders in the AFC to knock off the Chiefs to get to the Super Bowl. Now that obviously didn't pan out, but they were talked about like that. So, it's largely the same team with a couple other pieces here and there, just a couple years removed from CJ Stroud's incredible rookie year that he had. If he can get back to that same type of play and they can add some receiver depth, maybe a Cooper Kupp or a Davante Adams or, a number of any other guys that they could go after, they can get some talent around that. Their running back position is pretty set. Maybe beef up that offensive line, which I expect them to do in the NFL draft in just a few weeks. They could be right up there as being a contender, for the Super Bowl. They could be right there again, just talked about in the same way that they were just last year. The offseason is still very, very early, so it's possible that they can add some players to make them a real, real dangerous threat. They're most likely going to be favorites to win the AFC South again, just simply because that division, for lack of a better word, is just a mess. Usually each year and, year in and year out, you got the Colts who don't know what they're going to do at quarterback. You've got the Titans who don't know what they're going to do at quarterback. And then you've got the Jags who are, usually, they've got their quarterback in Trevor Lawrence, but there's still a lot of questions there too. So Houston seems to be still the best team in that division. They're the most equipped to win that division and potentially go on a little bit of a run in the playoffs. So they're standing pretty good right now as it stands, but a couple players here and there will definitely put them closer to teams like the Ravens or, the Bills or the Chiefs or the Bengals when they're healthy, or, any number of those teams, but it starts on the offensive line. It starts in the trenches. C.J. Stroud needs to be better for sure, but that offensive line needs to be better as well. Now, they're well coached. They've got DeMeco Ryans. He's a really good head coach. So they're, set there, of course. But there's just those pieces mainly on the interior of that offensive line that needs to be upgraded. And then, they could potentially, get even better, even despite the fact that that offensive line struggled. Look at how Joe Mixon played. He still managed to get over 1,000 yards, which may not be the number that it once was, but that's still a good number. You've got guys like Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley, getting either close to 2,000 or over 2,000 yards, kind of makes that just over 1,000 yard performance kind of small in comparison, but that's still an impressive number, especially with an offensive line that was less than stellar for most of the year. So I look at him as being a really good player, Joe Mixon, that is. Dameon Pierce may or may not even be on the team next year. We'll just have to see, what his cap situation is and, whether or not he is a free agent or not. I don't believe he is. I think he's got at least another year on his deal, but they could cut ties with him and maybe shell up or free up some cap space. That would be interesting to see if they go that route. But overall, I think the Houston Texans are going to be better next year. I still think they're going to win the division, of course. I think that division is going to be slightly better next year than it has been, with some changes kind of around the entire division. The only team that I would, say is probably kind of threatening to not be much different is the team I'm going to talk about tomorrow, and that's the Colts. And we'll get further into that when we talk about them tomorrow. But Houston, I've got them going 12-5 this year, and I've got them winning the AFC South. Again, this is a very, very early outlook, so we'll touch on it again as the season gets closer to kicking back off in a few months or several months after the summertime and training camp and all that. So we'll see how close they are to that record when it's all said and done. It's an exciting time here in the next week or so with NFL free agency. We're going to have a lot of different things to talk about because there's going to be deals that are going to be flying in, multiple deals a day, just much like it was, and has been over the past few years. I could absolutely see that happening again this year, especially with some interesting names out there and some guys that actually want to be, moved on from teams that they're, have spent all of their career with. Myles Garrett being one, Cooper Kupp being another, just to name a few. So it'll be interesting to see as we go along to see who moves on and who stays put. But it's going to be fun, and I'm looking forward to these shows coming up because there's going to be a lot of interesting stories out there. But once again, I do appreciate everybody joining in for this show today. Appreciate everything that you guys do in terms of commenting and supporting the show. Thank you once again for tuning in to the GSMC Football Podcast. We're presented once again by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support, as I said, means a lot to us. So please remember to subscribe to the show. Leave a positive review. It really does make a difference. We also invite you to follow us on all the social medias, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, or I guess Twitter's X now, but TikTok and Instagram, and for more content and updates. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful night, guys. We will see you next time. See ya.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to